Anyway, today is Father's Day. Lots of cheesy jokes going around. Sorry about that. I love being a dad. It's so fun. It's kind of a fun job. Don't get me wrong. It's a big job. There's a lot that comes with it that makes you kind of worry, and you think, or at least for me, like every 30 minutes, I'm wondering, am I doing this right? And chances are, I'm not. But it's a fun job. It's a hard job, but it's also a lot of fun and games. Dads have a license to be fun, and sometimes at the expense of safety and logic. One of the videos we have when the kids were young is Candy went to a women's thing. They used to have they call it Joy Fellowship on Tuesday nights at the Sherwood Church every so often, and so she went there and left us home alone, and so somewhere through the evening we decided that it was a good idea. The kids had a little shopping cart, one of those fake plastic carts, and so we shoved all of their stuffed animals. Well, I won't say all, a bunch of stuffed animals into the shopping cart and rolled it down the stairs and watched, like we videoed it as all of the things flew out. It's ridiculous, and but that's kind of what it is to be a dad, right? You get to have fun, right? I get to launch kids in the pool. Jackson was always a blast. I could probably make a basket with him, like in a basketball goal, because he was so fun to throw when he was smaller. Because he just and probably way higher than it should have been. We just have so many memories of doing fun things because dads get to do fun things. As men, we have a huge responsibility to lead our families in righteousness. Huge responsibility. That's a big deal. To be the protector in spiritual realms, to serve, to honor, and then also to have fun. And there's a significant part of Father's Day that's dedicated to relaxation, right? Whether that's a backyard barbecue or a day by the pool or a day at the lake. We got to go sailing yesterday, so I'm pumped up. And it's just, I love it. It's fun. It's relaxing. And there's a huge part of being a dad that is having fun and relaxing. We're working hard, we're loving big, and that can also be hard, and we're trying to lead wisely, and that can be very worrying, and there's all the stuff that we're carrying, but we also know how to relax. And that's what brings us into today's message in our summer series on the River of God, talking about God's manifest presence moving in our lives. It can be stressful sometimes. Life can be hard, but there's a place in the river of God that is relaxing, where we get to lay our burdens down, just like that testimony. There's a place in God's presence where we can just look in the face of His glory, or we can just soak for a few moments, sometimes even for hours, but we can stay there until things just kind of melt away, at least the burdens that we carry on the inside, if not the outside. We've been talking about the natural aspects of rivers and seeing what we can learn about God's presence. We talked about how they ebb and flow and how rivers bring life. And this week on Father's Day, I want to talk about how they can be relaxing and rejuvenating. Now, there are rushing rivers, and I love that. I love it when God's presence pushes us and carries us, and there's a roar. But there are also deep and wide rivers that can melt away the stresses and the heat of life. Sometimes the river of His presence drowns everything else, and sometimes we're just left with the tranquility of His peace. Psalm 23, verses 1 through 3. You guys know this. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the path of righteousness for His name's sake. It's the still waters of His presence. Today we're going to talk about resting in the river of His presence. Exodus 33:14, God said that His presence will go with us and He will give us rest. Now, rest is a huge topic in the Bible. It's a big thing, right? God is the one who gave us the Sabbath day and told us to rest. He himself rested from his work on the seventh day, right? We're commanded to take a rest, and rest in the physical is a big thing. It's a huge topic. It's very, very important. It's good for you mentally, physically. It's good for relationships. Taking a break from your work is a big deal, and it's awesome. But can I tell you that Jesus was much more concerned about our heart and soul than our bodies when it came to the things on the Sabbath? How many times did he talk to the Pharisees and the teacher of the law and say, guys, you get this whole Sabbath thing wrong, right? You're not willing to work, you're not willing to walk, you're not willing to heal on the Sabbath, and you're missing the point, because what God is interested in is our spirit man much more than our flesh man. So yeah, take a vacation, go to the Caribbean, stare at whatever you want to do. It's awesome. Invite me to come on if you're going to the Caribbean, right? Take a break. But what we're talking about this morning is the river of God flowing in the inner man to give us spiritual rest. God's river, for today, God's river is spiritual. There will be a day on the earth, I believe, that the river of God will literally flow. For today, it is a spiritual river, and the rest that it gives is spiritual. And can I tell you that what we need, more than anything else, I genuinely believe that our world and the church needs rest. Spiritual rest, emotional rest, mental rest. It's one thing if you are physically exhausted. The older I get, the more physically exhausted I get quicker, right? You go out and you mow the yard. I'll mow the yard. I'll play soccer. I'll do whatever. Stand up and go to the kitchen, whatever. And you start making these noises like, oh. It's one thing to be tired physically. Cool. You can sit down. You can take a nap. It's a whole different ball game when you cannot escape. It's easy to escape physical labor. It's hard to escape the torment of emotional burdens when the world seems to just start caving in from the inside of our brain. And can I tell you, it's hard, but there is a river. There is the manifest presence of God, and it can change a situation. And then even if it doesn't change a situation or a circumstance, the manifest presence of God, the river of God, can offer that rest and relaxation, just like a calm, soothing, deep, and wide river on a sweltering summer day. There can be peace in your soul. There can be joy in your spirit. There's time in His presence, and it's refreshing to the soul. It's refreshing. Let's get into this. First and foremost, there's peace by the river, beside the river. This is peace from a crazy world and protections from the pressures around us. This is the stuff that comes against us. There's peace by this river. Can I tell you that the world is crazy? Surprise. The world is nuts, and I'm not convinced that it's going to get any less nuts. I think it's going to continue to go in a way of chaos. No matter what's happening, though, there's a river. That no matter what happens in politics, no matter what happens in our economy, no matter what happens in our society, on the big pictures that we tend to worry about because we're addicted to social media and we start worrying about everything all over the world. And can I tell you, those things, they're going to continue to happen. There's going to continue to be chaos and crazy out there. The chaos and the crazy, just because you're alive as a human being and you're going through the world, the chaos and the crazy is going to continue to get closer and closer to your doorstep. Where it may not just be something that you see on the news, maybe something that you experience on the job. It may be something that you experience in relationships. And you know what? Life ebbs and flows, and it's all over the place. So maybe right now everything is good, but sooner or later you're going to find crazy coming to your door. And it's going to start knocking. Crazy becomes your neighbor. It becomes the annoying person down the street. It's pushing in. It's the people that are making noise. And it bothers you. I'm not talking about like physical noise. I'm talking about the junk that goes on around. These aren't necessarily evil things, but it's chaotic things. And if we're not careful, that chaotic stuff that's going on in the world around us begins to draw us down. These are real things, and the burden is heavy. But I love this passage from Psalm 46. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in time of trouble. Therefore we will not fear, even though the earth be removed and the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea. These are pretty chaotic times, right? Mountains being carried away. Though its waters roar and be troubled, though the mountains shake with its swelling, Selah. And that word just means stop and think about that. Stop and think about when all of that stuff starts happening, when the earth itself tends to shake and to move. Think about it. And then the answer is verse 4. It says, there is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy place of his tabernacle of the Most High. There is a river. There's a place where the Spirit of God dwells, and even in the midst of the world literally falling apart, there is a place where God's children are invited, where his river flows and we can find rest and relaxation. This is what we talk about when we talk about drawing the line and stepping into the sanctuary. Right? Years ago when I was youth pastors, I would always say this because Wednesday nights are tough, you know. You come from school or from sports or whatever, and you just kind of drag into youth group, and I'd always tell everybody, I was like, look, draw a line. Like I'd sometimes physically make them like do like that on the ground so they could step across it. But the idea is to say, you know what, we're going to leave our world on this side of that line, and we're going to step into his presence. And that's what we are invited to when we can step into the river of God. It's the craziness that goes on around us. And it's not just the world, by the way, that makes things crazy. Sometimes it gets complicated and sometimes frustrating, even to be a minister. And you're out there and you're trying to work and build the kingdom and grow the kingdom, and you're trying to prepare your kids, and you're working and you're working and you're working, not just physically, because then you could just sit down. But it's all of the emotional drain, the spiritual drain, because you're pouring out and pouring out and pouring out. And it's so very important that it can start messing with you, but there is a peace in God's presence that we can focus on him, where everything else can fade away, where he speaks, peace be still, where fear melts and we are glad. Sometimes you don't even have to be in the river, right? Sometimes just staring at it can make, there's a bunch of studies out there that talk about, they call them blue spaces. And it turns out that just looking at water, at bodies of water, will make you calm. And it's really crazy. There's all kinds of things about that. That's why it's, there's often fish tanks, like in doctors' offices, especially areas where they're dealing with very, very sick people. They'll have some fish tanks or some water features or things because it's soothing. That's just how God wired us. Sometimes you don't even have to be in the river to experience the peace. And that's where I think that the peace that I'm talking about today will be one of the testimonies that will draw the world to us. Because I believe that, and the world is crazy. It's going to get crazier. Everybody's going to experience that. And if we, the church, find ourselves in a place where we are in the river and we're close to the presence of God and we're allowing him to keep our hands steady and us unafraid because we're walking in his presence, then I believe that there's a whole bunch of people out there. They're going to look at us and say, wait a minute, why do you have this hope? And how can I have that? And then we can start offering a place of a sanctuary where we say, well, let me talk to you about Jesus. Let me tell you about the Spirit of God that's inside of me. They don't even have to be in the river yet to experience. If they just look at us, they can see the peace of God flowing through us. And that is a testimony that is very powerful. It will draw people. I genuinely believe that will draw people in our crazy world. Peace by the river. It's a sanctuary from the crazy world and protection from the pressures around us. Secondly, there's refreshing in the river. You think being by the river is good. You should get in the river. Beside the river brings peace to eternal or external crazy, but sometimes it's the craziness that comes from inside of us that we've got to have a rest from. Unfortunately, these are things that we just can't escape because the torment comes from our own minds and our own imaginations sometimes, and it follows us, and it's hard. Matthew 11:28, and we'll talk more about this, but let me just start off with some hope here. It says, "Come to me," this is Jesus speaking, "come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." When we wade into the presence of God, we have to lay aside our burdens or we'll sink. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about the memorial stones, and we talked about how it had to be a miracle that God stopped the river and that they were able to walk into the Jordan on dry ground and pick up the rocks, because otherwise, if the river was flowing, they wouldn't have been able to pick it up because it was too heavy. And you get the idea. You can't swim with weights. They make you sink. So if you're going to be in the river of God, you've got to lay down your burdens first. You can lay them down. Sometimes people can just flush their worries and enjoy God's presence. Sometimes it happens. Then other times, the burdens that we bring into God's presence really do pull us down and pull us under. And normally this is a bad thing. And so if we're talking about physical rivers, then don't do this. But if we're talking about spiritual rivers, sometimes when we can't shed those burdens ourselves so that we can swim in the river of God, sometimes when we walk in, we do get drowned by it. Sometimes we are overcome by the presence of God. Sometimes there really is a baptism of His Spirit that overcomes us, and we are undone, and we die to self, and we have to die to our own plans and our own strategies because they don't work. Sometimes we are in His presence and we're like, "God, will you just take this from me?" And you start looking around, and everything that you had hoped for, everything that you had prayed for, it's all failed, it's all gone, it can't be done. But there is His Spirit, His sweet Spirit that revives hope in that moment, that speaks to you and says, "Child, it's going to be okay." And maybe you don't understand how it's going to work out because the ones and the zeros just don't align. But you can feel in that moment as you're overwhelmed by His presence that the burdens are starting to fall away. It's baptism. Sometimes the weights are hard to carry, but on the upside, they won't let you swim. And you'll be overcome and refreshed by His Spirit. The truth is, once you are able to shed those weights, which are very difficult to do, the good news is that when those come off, you find that you yourself weigh less in the river. The human body is partially buoyant. Percentages depend on who you are. But the human body is partially buoyant. You're actually lighter in the river than you would be on the ground. Sometimes it's not what we carry, but it's who we are that's weighing us down. Sometimes the weight is self-induced. And we see that, you know what, I'm not carrying something, I am the problem. Right? Sometimes the mirror is tough because you're like, "Oh, I can't blame anybody else. I failed. I am the problem. I met the enemy and it's me. This is my own crazy." But you're lighter in the river. Because as you walk into God's presence, not only are we laying down our burdens, but He is lifting us up. It's in His presence that He begins to speak to us. and we can recalibrate all these things. It's where he starts calling us child. That we're approved to be in his presence. And that's a significant word. That's a big word. That we have been tried and found acceptable. That's what it means to be approved, right? It's that we are tested. And that's what the Bible says about us, that we are approved to be in his presence because of the blood of Jesus. And when you look at it that way, you're like, well, you know what? Maybe the burden that I think that I am isn't so bad. Because God is lifting us up. It's not my own fail. I've failed. I've messed up. I've said the wrong thing. I've done the wrong thing. I've gone the wrong way. But then God, in his presence, when we're walking into his river, he takes not only our burdens off, but he begins to let us float. And what we carry in ourselves, it no longer weighs us down because he's calling us child, because he's spreading his wings over us. He declares that we're approved, that we're kings and priests, that his love is unending and his mercy never fails. It's a big deal. We find ourselves in the river where we are undone by his presence. The burdens are laid down, and we find peace, not just from the crazy around us, but from the crazy inside of us. Okay? All right, last but not least, bonus material, once again. Just because I'm talking about rest doesn't mean that you don't move. Because it turns out that rivers are awesome to look at. They're fun to swim in if you find a deep and wide river. You know, yesterday we went sailing at Heber Springs, and we were out there, and it was kind of fun. Jacob jumped off the boat, and we were sailing slowly, that he was able to jump off, swim, and get to the back of the boat before we passed, and that was refreshing. He would get out and splash water all over us, and you know what? It was refreshing. It was refreshing to put our legs down in there. And you know what? That's just a wide spot in the river. There's a river there. Somebody put a big concrete wall, and next thing you know, you got a lake. But deep and wide rivers are fun to swim in, but they still move. They're refreshing, but you're still going somewhere. Sometimes, after you spend a moment, sometimes a long moment, in God's presence in his river, you look up and you come back to the bank, and you see that you have moved. Situations have changed. I can't explain it, but it's happened to me. Not very often. I wish it happened more, but I can think of a few times, specific times in my life, where I've come to God and I've said, God, I've got all these things going on, and I was carrying so many burdens, and they were the external crazy. And I spent a few minutes in God's presence, and he did a work, changed things that should have taken years or months to change, and it happened right there. I can't explain it. I just know the river is moving, and sometimes God physically moves you when you are in his presence. Sometimes that happens. Most of the time, that doesn't happen. He's trying to calibrate expectations here. Most of the time, that doesn't happen. But there's still a movement in you. If you're going to be in God's presence, if you're really in the river of God's presence, then a couple things happen. First, there's sweet relief. That's the idea of the sanctuary. That's what we talked about. That's when you get in and you're instantly cooled off. That's when you're looking and the river is roaring, and it just drowns out everything else. And there's that momentary relief. But there's also a staying power to that. Because sometimes the river carries you along and puts you in a different place. Other times you come back to the bank and everything is the same as you left it. All the crazy is still out there, but there's something different inside of you. It's rest in God's presence. It's rejuvenation in God's presence, but it is not stagnation. You may come back and all of the situations are the same, But if you have spent a moment in His presence, you are different. At the very least, now you've got a renewed hope, a renewed joy. You've got the Spirit of God inside of you. And you can make it one more day. One more 30 minutes. I don't know how long it's going to be before you got to go back to the river and you say, well, I'm back again. It's a continual thing, but when you leave, you're different. And you can make it for just another little while, just one more step. Things are not the same. And most of the time, it's just in here. But the river moves, and He'll move you.